Good evening or good morning, and thanks to the organizers for bringing us all together. I'd like to talk about some work in my lab that's being led by a grad student, Amrit Singh. I believe that Amrit's here in the audience. I certainly hope so in case we get hard questions. And this is a project that's exploring what it means to think abstractly and asking whether some cultures are more inclined toward abstract thinking than others. So one cross-cultural difference discussed in hundreds of papers is this difference in mindset between Westerners, meaning typically North Americans or Western Europeans, and East Asians, usually Chinese, Japanese, or South Korean people. And in this literature, as I'm sure you know, Westerners are typically characterized as individualistic and East Asians as collectivistic. What does this mean? Well, Westerners tend to think of themselves as more independent and are more focused on the self, whereas East Asians are more interdependent, focused on their relationships with other people. And these tendencies, these personal tendencies, co-vary with more analytic or holistic styles of perception. Arguably, what ties together these bundles, these different cognitive profiles, is either a greater or a lesser sensitivity to the physical and social context. So having a holistic or an analytic perceptual style, which is sometimes metaphorized as seeing the forest or just seeing the trees, means being more or less sensitive to the physical context in which objects are embedded. Having an independent or interdependent interpersonal style means being more or less sensitive to your social context. So the question that we're going to ask is, what are the cognitive consequences of these different levels of attention to the physical and social context? Well, the answer to that question depends who you ask. Perhaps surprisingly, there are cultural psychologists who have argued that attention to the context traps you in a concrete world of the visible and the tangible. In a landmark paper, Richard Nisbet and colleagues suggested that East Asians should be more concrete in their conceptualizations and should have a greater concern with concrete objects and events than Westerners. By contrast, Westerners should be more capable than East Asians of reasoning based on logical rules. Now, to our knowledge, there's only one paper that tested this suggestion directly. Norenzayan et al. In 2002 compared East Asians and Westerners' formal reasoning abilities. And they found that Westerners were better at certain kinds of syllogisms, a classic form of logical inference. But the only studies that we know of that have tried to replicate this finding have failed. So we're for the moment, we're treating these findings as a maybe. It's notable, however, that these suggestions in these important papers from the 21st century in cultural psychology echo claims from Western scholars over the past century about Westerners and non-Westerners' tendencies toward abstract thought. In particular, Chinese people have really gotten the brunt of this. We have claims like Chinese people have no taste for abstract symbols, the Chinese language is an unsuitable vehicle for abstract ideas, and traditional Chinese thinking was indifferent to abstraction. Now, this sounds like it must just be crazy and racist and unprincipled, but let's ask for a moment, why might Western scholars have believed things like this? Well, granting the possibility that there are some reasons other than prejudice or exoticization, one suggestion has been that writing systems might be either a cause or a consequence of differing levels of abstract thought. So compared to Western alphabets, logographic characters are concrete by virtue of their iconicity. It's also possible to find differences in the complexity of morphology or syntax between East Asian and European languages. And in the cultural psych literature, scholars have suggested that modern psychological differences might be traced to the ancient philosophy of the East and the West. Only in the West were methods developed for formal logic and computation. This latter point, this formal logic, has been the focus of the only experimental work that is addressing this question directly of which cultures think more abstractly. But if we think about it, formal logic is only one instance of abstract thinking. Other ways that people can think more or less abstractly include, for example, thinking about wholes instead of parts, thinking about relationships or about the objects that are being related, thinking about actions goals instead of the details of an action's implementation, and you knew I'd get there, thinking analogically. So as a paradigm case of abstract thought. If we look at these first two, these have been tested. How people think about wholes versus parts and how people think about relations versus the things being related have been tested across lots of studies. And we have lots of previous data that bear on whether East Asians or Westerners are more likely to think abstractly in these ways, in these perceptual ways. The last two on this list concern higher cognition, and these have been the subject of the work that I'll discuss from my lab. Overall, what I'm going to argue is that rather than being an impediment to abstract thinking, sensitivity to the physical and context can be an engine of abstract thought. Turning to this first idea, thinking about wholes instead of parts that compose the wholes, thinking globally, that is, instead of locally. This is one of the most intuitive notions of what it means to think abstractly. That's what we mean when we use expressions like seeing the forest instead of the trees, right? Well, in fact, seeing the forest or the trees is almost exactly the title of a classic paper concerning global versus local visual perception. When people are given stimuli like this, people of all cultures tend to attend more quickly to the global gestalt, the big letter, rather than to the little letters that make up the big letter. This is a task by Navon from the 1970s. When this tendency to see the forest before the trees, to see the abstract gestalt first, is stronger in East Asians than it is in Westerners. Now, this task was not intended as a test of abstract versus concrete thinking, but it's straightforward to reinterpret it that way. And when we do, it's the Asians who are attending to the more abstract level of perceptual organization. Turning to a second notion of abstractness, thinking about relationships or about the objects being related, the same is true. In a now classic study known as the Michigan fish task, at cultural psychology conferences, everyone is required to put this picture on their slide somewhere, so I'm just doing my job. This task shows how attention to objects versus relations differs across cultures. When asked to describe this underwater scene, Westerners were more likely to mention objects, saying things like, oh, there was a frog, whereas East Asians were more likely to report relationships between those objects, noting that the frog doesn't just exist, that the frog is embedded in this scene and it's swimming out of some seaweed, etc. So let's sort of tally up where things stand. So far, we've mentioned these 5 different notions of what it means to think abstractly. And the first one we're going to consider still, so the jury is still out. But the next one, we've got pretty good evidence across a bunch of studies that East Asians are more likely than Westerners to see the forest before the trees, to think about wholes instead of parts, and more likely than Westerners to attend to relations between objects and not just to the individuated objects themselves. For these final two, my students and I have turned to some widely used tests of abstract thinking. The first is a test of how people think about actions. So this is lifted from the social psychology literature from the 1980s. Valashay and Wegner bequeathed us this questionnaire that's been used hundreds of times to probe how people think about actions. The questionnaire is called the Behavioral Identification Form. I'll abbreviate it as the BIF. So it's predicated on the idea that actions are structured hierarchically. The same action can be conceptualized at different levels of abstraction. So take an action like voting. You can think about voting multiple different ways. In its most concrete form, voting means performing a motor action, marking a ballot, making a check in a box, or pulling a lever, right? At a much more abstract level, voting means trying to influence an election. Now, which of these is the right way to think about voting? Well, there is no right way, but people can tend to construe this action, voting and lots of other actions, at either a concrete or an abstract level more naturally. So that's what the BIF, the Behavioral Identification Form, asks. There are 25 items like voting where people see this questionnaire and they see that the action named, and then they get two options, an abstract construal and a concrete construal, and they choose which one seems like the best description of the action to them. So we've used this to compare head-to-head East Asians and Westerners to address the question, do East Asians or Westerners and Westerners differ in how abstractly they tend to think about actions, whether they tend to adopt this high-level action construal or a more concrete low-level construal. So what should we predict? Well, if we take a page from the cross-cultural psychology literature and posit that attention to the context mires you in the details, right? Traps you in the concrete, then Westerners should tend to construe these actions more concretely than East Asians. Alternatively, if it's the case that context helps you to see the big picture, then the East Asians should be construing these same actions more concretely. How can we find out? Well, we just need to look at how many of these BIF questionnaire items people construe abstractly or concretely across cultures. So here's what the data look like. On the x-axis, this is how many out of 25 items individuals have construed abstractly on average. More farther to the right is more abstract construals, farther to the left is more concrete construals. And this is just a box plot. The diamond is the mean. And this up here is a half violin. It's like a smooth histogram. So you can see there's a big hump in the middle. It's a little bit bimodal, but in general, US participants are somewhere in the middle here, about 15 items on average that they are construing abstractly. If we compare that to the Chinese, we see that there is a highly significant difference. The Chinese, and you can see that the distribution of responses is really skewed differently in the Chinese, skewed way toward the abstract end of things. That compared to the US participants, this large national sample of Chinese participants show a much stronger tendency to construe the same actions more abstractly. So for brevity, I'm just giving you one big graph about all of these studies, but actually Amrit ran this study 3 times in 3 independent pairs of large national online samples of Chinese people and US participants. And we get the same result every time, which is why we just aggregate them for simplicity. And this relationship holds, this cross-cultural difference holds, even when we control for demographic factors that could plausibly affect how abstractly people construe things like age and sex and education level do not interact with the difference of interest. So one limitation of this kind of cross-cultural study, that there's a virtue of doing national online samples in people's home country in their native languages, which is validity, external validity. A limitation is that you are varying lots of things, right? You're varying in addition to this abstract notion of culture, you're varying the genetics of the population, the location of the population, the economics, and perhaps consequentially, the language that they're speaking. The Chinese people did the BIF in a careful translation that our Mandarin collaborators did. Are we sure that what we're seeing here has something to do with culture as opposed to language? Well, one of the ways that we've gone about making sure that we're seeing cultural differences and not linguistic differences is to ask the same question within China, within subcultures of China, where everyone is speaking the same language, Mandarin Chinese, but they are members of different subcultures within the larger country. So how do we, what we want here are subcultures that are known to differ in this relevant characteristic of individualism versus collectivism. How would we find them? Well, fortunately, Thomas Talham and colleagues have identified provinces that are historically associated with wheat growing or rice growing. And Talham and others have shown that, excuse me, this individualism versus collectivism distinction that we find across nations and across Eastern and Western cultures can be found within different provinces of China that historically grow rice or wheat. Why? Well, look at these pictures of what it takes to be a rice farmer versus a wheat farmer. You are shoulder to shoulder with others when you're farming rice, and you can be a lone ranger as a wheat farmer. And accordingly, within China, previous studies have shown more collectivistic tendencies in rice province members of rice provinces than in wheat provinces. So we knew where the participants in our Chinese sample were located when they performed the task. And Amrit was able to sort the data into rice versus wheat province and test whether the people from rice provinces who have been established previously to be more collectivistic were construing events more abstractly versus people from wheat provinces who have been established previously to be more individualistic were adopting more concrete construals. And that's just what we find. So rice provinces on top, more collectivistic, wheat provinces on bottom, more individualistic. Now, this is a highly significant difference, but it's more subtle. The difference in means is more subtle within China than between China and the US. Perhaps that's to be expected, just to convince ourselves that this is not only statistically reliable, but really robust. Amrit plotted this difference between rice versus wheat for each of the 25 items on the BIF. And as you can see here, 24 out of the 25 show this pattern where the people from rice provinces choose more abstract construals. So it looks like quite a robust tendency. So let's go back to our tally here. It looks like we can put another check in the column where East Asians are thinking more abstractly as indexed by the way that they construe actions in terms of their high-level goals instead of their concrete implementations. Let's turn to analogical reasoning. Now, should we expect East Asians to be better at analogical reasoning than Westerners, and if so, why? Well, what makes analogical reasoning abstract? Analogy requires discovering invisible, intangible relationships between objects or ideas that, of course, may appear dissimilar on the surface, at the concrete level. Thinking about relationships means thinking about objects or ideas in the context of other objects or ideas. Compared to Westerners, East Asians exhibit more relational, that is, more context-dependent patterns of perceiving and of understanding the physical and social world. So if you're more inclined toward relational thinking and toward considering objects in context, maybe you should be better at analogy, right? That's the reasoning behind our testing this. How do we test analogy in a culture-neutral way? So many tests of analogy are strongly dependent on language. Well, luckily, we have an almost century-old test that's been administered in thousands of samples, Raven's progressive matrices, that is entirely pictorial, right? It's just wonderful for very, very portable for taking across cultures. This is a standard, this is a sample item from the standard progressive matrix task. The participant's job is to figure out what the analogical relationships between the parts of the puzzles are. So you get this grid, this matrix, and you see these transformations horizontally and vertically. And your job is to choose one of these 8 puzzle pieces down here that fits into the series analogically. So it's fun to let people figure this out for themselves. I'm sure you could do it. Actually, in this group, you've probably seen the SPM many times. But the point here is that it's a nonverbal test of analogy. There are a bunch of different subscales within this task. We recruited participants in US and China in large national online samples. Once again, the instructions were given in the native language, but all of the problems are purely pictorial. We used only set E of this multi-set task. For people who are familiar with the SPM, that's the last set of 12 trials. The reason is that this is more, oh, I'm out of time. This is the most clearly analogical. You can't just do a pattern completion to solve this question. Then we got some demographics. Here's the punchline. Chinese people in this national online sample were much better at this task of analogical reasoning than our Caucasian US participants, embarrassingly better, almost 50% higher scores. This is the number of correct responses out of 12. To make sure that we weren't fooling ourselves and to hope that the US Caucasians would catch up a little bit and the difference would be slightly less embarrassing, we ran it again in another large online national sample, found the same pattern, slightly less embarrassing. But we can confidently put a check in this last box on our chart. Indeed, these cross-cultural differences that we found previously generalize to analogical reasoning. To wrap up, people from collectivistic cultures and subcultures are more likely to think abstractly than people from individualistic cultures, as indexed both by tests of event construal and by this test of analogical reasoning. These results challenge a long-standard generalization that East Asians think less abstractly than Westerners, and support this idea that sensitivity to context does not trap people in a concrete world. On the contrary, attending to context is an engine of abstract thought. Thanks to the people who gave us their money, and thanks especially to the grad students who did all of this work. And thank you for your attention.